Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to slow stitch a chocolate chip cookie. And it's kind of realistic. Now in my lifetime, I have baked a number of chocolate chip cookies, thousands of them, between working at the restaurant with my father and my kids growing up and my husband's love for cookies at that point. I have made thousands. And now even, my father-in-law enjoys them tremendously, so he has weekly cookies. But I've never slow stitched them before until now. I think these look good enough to eat, so I do have to keep them away from him. So let me show you how I create them. So to make a chocolate chip cookie out of fabric, it's a really fun process. A little tedious at times, but very fun. Now there are lots of variations. I'm going to show you one method of doing it. You don't have to do it this way. Basically what you want to do is have a round of fabric. Now the most basic way, you can just cut out a round and use it, frayed edges and all, and that's perfectly acceptable. If you do it this way, you might want to take a little piece of batting and cut it just slightly smaller than your circle so that you can cover the padded circle with your fabric. And this gives your cookie a little more dimension. It's completely optional and you don't have to do it. You can make a round of the cookie, and I have a method that I showed you, I'll link the video below, where you use one of these tools, the yo-yo maker. And we're not going to use the yo-yo aspect, we're just going to use that perfectly round circle. And there are other techniques and other tools. Today I'm going to use this one that I have, which I happen to love. It requires a little bit of work, but it produces really sharp circles. And this is the brand Aplapops. I'm not affiliated with them by any stretch of the imagination. I just like this tool. You get a set of them, 2 rings for all different sizes. It doesn't really matter for this technique what size circle. And like I said, you can just cut it out. But this one is approximately, it's going to be approximately 5 centimeters or 2 inches in diameter when we're done. I'll show you how to use this. It's really simple and I love that, especially if you want that sharp edge. You'll need your fabric for your cookie. You can use any color fabric or any pattern. If you want it to look realistic, look for a off brown or a caramel color. I happen to like the ones with a little white print inside of it because it looks like the highlights of the cookie, but you don't need it. You can go with just a beige fabric. To make the chips and the cracks in the cookie, I like to use 2 shades of brown, a dark one and a not so dark one. And so the numbers I'm using are 938 and 801. That's just what I had on hand. I didn't buy it specifically for the cookie. On the lighter of the 2, I have threaded a needle with 1 strand to make the cracks and 5 strands to make the chips. And I left all 6 strands of the darker thread on my needle to make the chips. This way it just has a little more texture and a little more body. Then I'm using just a little string of pearl thread here, and that's just to close the circle. I'm just making the cookie. I'm not attaching it to a background today, but to attach it to your backing will be the same procedure because you don't want the stitches to show. And if you do want the stitches to show, even better. At the end of the video, I'll show you some variations on the cookies that I've made using different fabrics and slightly different techniques. But it's the same procedure, just some variations. So to get started, I want to make that perfectly round shape of the cookie. I'm going to use this fabric, this little beige fabric with the white dots. And so I purposely found a scrap that was big enough that I have give here. I can fold it over and I'll trim it down further. I'll set these aside. Now here are the tools that I need to make this perfectly round circle. I need some spray sizing or starch. It doesn't have to be spray. You can use a brush just as easily. I'm just doing the really quick method with a spray. Your fabric, a hot iron, and you need 2 of these tools. They fit inside each other. Any 2 sizes will work. I cut a square of fabric so that it's larger than my largest piece. Then I put my largest circle down, put my fabric on top of it, and then that piece that fits inside the center, just inside of it. And it fits perfectly. As you can see here, if I hold it down so it doesn't come out, I get this beautiful round shape when I pull my fabric in. But my fabric, there's a lot of excess here. So I'm just going to take it and just round the edges here. There'll still be a little bit of excess, but that's okay. I'm going to need that excess to not only build up the piece, but to make that perfect edge. Now you can always trim more off if you want. I just like to work with a lot because I can always trim it later. So then I'm just going to gently start dry folding it here. No heat, just the pressure of my arms. So that works out pretty well. Again, you could trim it further if you wanted. So from here I just take it down. I'll start at the 12 o'clock and I'm just gently ironing it down. Again, I want to make sure it stays in its little section, and I'll continue all the way around, pulling the fabric in and ironing it down. Can rotate this piece, and while the fabric isn't staying that way permanently yet, we don't have the starch, I'm just training the fabric to go this way first. Makes it a little easier, I find. If you go to the website for the actual product, they'll give you their official instructions. And I will link all that below. Then I like to just iron over everything. Again, pushing it in to the center each time. So I have a little bit going on here. So that works out pretty well. Now I'm going to take my spray starch, shake it, and just spray my fabric. Then with my fingers, you can use a brush. I'm just going to saturate that fabric. By wetting it, it makes it a little easier to work with. It's more malleable. And now I just take my hot iron and I press that fabric and I hold it down a few seconds and I turn it around and do the same thing. And I'm going to continue working my way all the way around. Now the metal disc will get hot, so just keep that in mind. But, you know, sewing isn't for the weak, so we just keep that in mind and be careful. As the fabric starts to give, I can start to hold everything down just with the iron. And it just takes a little bit of time just to get that the way I want it. I'm trying to dry my fabric and keep it trained to the position that I want. I'm not touching the metal piece now because it's exceptionally hot, but that's exactly what's training that fabric to stay down. So now I'll remove my iron and you can see the fabric stays down by itself, and I just need to let this cool. If you're impatient like me, this is a good time to put away things in your studio that need to be put away, or do some light cleaning, or go get a cup of coffee, because you really need to let this cool. You don't want to work with the hot ring, and it will also mess up the beautiful circle that you've made. Okay, so it's cooled down. This is what it looks like on the other side. And if you gently pop out the piece, you're left with your first ring, your larger ring, and then the second ring. You can see it makes a very nice circle. I'm going to just gently fold up just enough of the fabric that I can pull out that other ring, so you can see the parts that make this. And now I have a beautiful circle. So if I wanted to, I could take a little piece of fabric and stuff it in there. So maybe I'll do that and just show you. It makes just a little more dimension, and it's a pretty good idea. So I'll just cut a circle here. And this is what I was talking about with if you just cut a piece of fabric and you wanted to have a circle inside for a little dimension. So I'll just stuff this piece inside very gently. It's not a perfect circle, but it will work just fine. And now I want to attach this to the backing. I am going to remove the backing eventually so that I have just the cookie that I can use in my work. But you can see how nice it is. So I'm taking that cotton pearl here and I'm just going to make very tiny stitches just around the edges, coming up from the bottom through the top, and I'll just go back down. And I can just do this every so often on this cookie or on this fabric round. You're just trying to attach the fabric and maintain its shape at this point. And you would do this if you were cutting the fabric into just a round shape, or if you were using the yo-yo maker. No matter what device you were using to get your round, or whatever method you were using to get your round, this is the next step. So this is where you'd start again following this procedure. Now, if you wanted to, you could stitch it right to your work. You don't have to stitch it to a backing and then to your work. You can just attach it to your work, and I'll show you some examples of how I did that afterwards. So once you've stitched all the way around, you just want to knot your thread on the back. You can see my large stitches here. So now I have my cookie stitched down. You can see it's starting to look like a cookie. It's actually really cute. There are lots of methods you can do with variations to make other types of cookies, but let's stick with the chocolate chip cookie. So I'm going to start right away with my 801. That's the lighter of the browns that I'm using. You don't have to use this color. This is just the one strand on a needle, and I want to start by making cracks to the cookie. So I want to make maybe, say, 3 cracks coming out from the edges. So I'll start right at the edge of that cookie, bringing my needle up right where the cookie and the backing meet. And I'm going to just stitch little stitches here. Not straight lines. I want each stitch to just come off away from itself. So I'm going to start here, and I'm just going to do a series of back stitches, and this way the stitches will meet up. I want to make sure they meet up. If I do leave a little space, I'll come back in and connect those lines. And that's the beauty of this crack effect, is it just looks realistic. You don't have to go in the same direction twice, although you certainly can. You want it to look a little cracked, a little haphazard, and lots of little stitches. And this is what I mean about this process is a little tedious, but the results really can't be beat. So I'm coming up here, really trying to make sure my stitches connect. And now I want to create that Y. So I'm going to have one stitch coming from maybe over here and back to the previous stitch. And then you can change direction again, just like a crack would. It wouldn't necessarily be expected. And now I want to go and create that Y. So at any point along this way, I can just jut out from that crack. I'm going to come up here. This is a much longer stitch than I was doing, but that's the beauty of it. And I'll make another little stitch next to it. Now you can make this crack venture out again and turn into a Y again if you want. But I'm happy with that first crack. I'll do 2 more, one over here and one over here, and then we'll start the next process. So I completed 3 cracks coming out from the cookie, and I spaced them somewhat evenly. They weren't too close together. You can add additional cracks that come out from the cookie, or you can just add little cracks going through here. This cookie, for this size, I think is appropriate just the way I did it, but if I was doing a larger cookie, I would definitely add additional cracks. And this is what it looks like on the back. You can see my stitch little mapping here. So now I'm going to take that same color thread, and this is just 5 strands. It's the 6 strands minus the one I used for the cracks, and I'm going to make just little teeny seed stitches. Now I'm not going to keep them close together at all. I'm just going to make little seed stitches approximately the same size as these little white prints on the fabric, just to give you an idea. If you don't use fabric with the white prints, that's totally fine. You can add stitches with white, or you can just skip that altogether and just add these little stitches here, these seed stitches that I'm showing. And I'm just adding them every so often. Strategically, I'm trying not to cover the little white print that I'm using from this fabric, just to make that fabric really work. So I'll just add a few, not even counting. I'm just kind of sticking the stitches in every so often. I can always come back and add more. But for now, I just want to add a few. This gives a little texture, like either a burnt spot or a crispy spot, or maybe part of a chocolate chip that maybe broke off in the batter. So that looks pretty good. Again, I can come back in and add more if I want, but you can see how this cookie is starting to develop. I'll knot my thread on the back, and now we're going to dive in and make our chocolate chips. For the chocolate chips, I'm using the 938 color, just a dark color, all 6 strands. And I'm going to start in one spot here, and I'm going to stitch what looks like chocolate chips. Now, I don't want to stitch them in a perfect shape. You can, but I find it looks a little more realistic if it's a rougher shape. So I made a first stitch that's about double the size, the length of those stitches that I made with the just slightly lighter color. And now I'm going to come in side by side and stitch a few satin stitches just next to it. Not the same size. I'm going to vary the size. And I'll go on either side of the original stitch that I made. Some stitches will be shorter and some will be longer. And you can see I have 3 stitches here and there's a little space in here. So that's where I want to go with that last stitch. Don't want to stick it out quite so much. We'll see how it looks. So I have a very unusual shape, but it looks realistic as a chip that was put in a cookie and cooked and baked. So it has a very organic feel to it, a very just unpredictable feel. I'll turn my cookie around, look for an open spot, and add another chip using that same procedure. Now the chips can go over the lines, the cracks that we stitched if you want. They don't have to though. I tend not to. It's not very realistic necessarily, but I also don't want to confuse the eye when I'm stitching. So it's kind of interesting because you want some parts to look realistic and other parts to just be suggestive. And you don't always have to use 4 stitches. You can use 3 stitches or 2 stitches. And you can see that my chocolate chips are starting to come together. I'll continue doing this, filling up the cookie as I think is appropriate. So I finished stitching the chips. You could of course add more if you like, particularly if you're somebody who really enjoys a loaded chocolate chip cookie. You could also make variations on these. You can add the little M&Ms they put into cookies, the colored candies. It's totally up to you. I just think it looks adorable and pretty good. Now I want to show you a couple of variations. I created the same technique using the same fabric and colors and everything. I didn't use the little tool. I just kind of made the cookie, and it's not quite perfect, the shape, but it's effective. It certainly does look like a cookie. And then my last one that I really love is my little Cookie Monster cookie, and I even put in a blue C for that. Again, I used different fabric, and because this fabric didn't have the white dots on it, I used little just purl stitches here just to make a few highlights in the cookie. I think the white dots help it, and as you can see here, I added a lot more cracks based on the square footage of the cookie. So those are some chocolate chip cookies that look good enough to eat if you ask me. Maybe I'm just hungry. So that's how I make the slow stitched cookies. I think they look realistic. They're adorable, they're easy to do, a little tedious, but I show you that. And there are different methods you can use by creating that round shape. You can do the most basic by just cutting out a circle, or use some different tools to create that perfect circle. The choice is yours. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And please consider becoming a paid member of my channel. Thanks for joining me today.